A warm welcome to today's video explaining the criticisms of utilitarianism for philosophy A-level. Now we will begin with Novic's experience machine. Now this is a very simple criticism. It uses a thought experiment to show a flaw in the reasoning of the utilitarianism, specifically that of Bentham. So in the experience machine, we are like a brain in a vat, and we can have any number for the rest of our life, any number of pleasurable experiences, whether that be a rock star or a famous philosopher. And for the utilitarian, they should always go in the experience machine. And that's because in the machine, we're always going to have more pleasure than we would in our normal day-to-day life. And so this is fine. This isn't really a criticism if you just accept that you would always go in the experience machine. If you'd never live your normal life and you'd always live in the experience machine. Novic also asked us to forget all of the technical issues that might arise if every person went in the machine. So if you accept that you'd always go in the machine, fine, move on. No criticism. It's only a criticism if you wouldn't go in the experience machine, if you would just prefer to live your own normal life. And it's a problem because it shows that we're governed by the sovereign masters, but also by something else as well. If we're choosing not to maximise our pleasure, then there's some other thing as well that governs our behaviour that isn't just pain and pleasure. Novic doesn't need to show what that is. He doesn't need to suggest what that could be. All he needs to do, which he does if you don't go in the experience machine, is show that there's clearly something else that we value other than the sovereign masters. And that's a flaw in Bentham's reasoning, because Bentham suggests that all we value ultimately is pain and pleasure, the two sovereign masters. And so that's that criticism. The next criticism is the tyranny of the majority. Now this is an absolute classic when it comes to criticising utilitarianism. So it's just about justifying the pleasure of the many against the rights of the few. And so we must always, in quantitative utilitarianism, we must always value more pleasure over less pleasure, because it's a quantity game. It's about what gets us more. And so we can use a thought experiment like a society is kept completely happy, satisfied, pleasurable, without any wars or conflict, but once a year they must sacrifice a single baby. Obviously the baby is completely innocent, but once a year they must randomly select a baby to sacrifice. Now for whatever reason this keeps society happy. The problem is, not only is the violation of this baby's rights permissible under utilitarianism, the bigger problem is that it's actually obligated. The president of this society would literally have to, he would have a moral obligation to violate the rights of this baby to keep society happy. And so we can show that there's clearly something wrong, evidently there's something wrong with this reasoning of the utilitarian. If they can justify, not only justify, but obligate the killing of a baby. I mean, it doesn't get any more clear than that. If you can justify that, you can create a tyranny of the majority. There's clearly something wrong in the reasoning here to lead to such a palpably absurd moral landscape. And so that's the tyranny of the majority criticism. And next we move on to issues with the hedonic calculus. The first criticism here is what I'm terming a category error, after Gilbert Ryle's category errors, of course. Now, if you don't know what these are, I've got a dedicated video on my channel, but the category error here that's being made is with pleasure. So pleasure is not the type of thing which can be calculated and measured. We can't measure pleasure. We can measure chemicals in the brain, but that's something slightly different. So if we look at the diagram here, you can see that pleasure can be scientifically calculated. That's what Bentham is trying to do. And this is specifically for moral dilemmas. But the problem is pleasure is not the type of thing which can be calculated. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, if I said grief, let's measure our grief, let's compare our grief, let's compare the intensity of our grief or our stress or our calmness, then suddenly it becomes quite absurd. And that's because although the sentence, pleasure can be measured, we can measure pleasure, sort of makes sense, when we actually think about what those terms mean, what it actually means to say pleasure can be measured, for me at least, it becomes quite meaningless. And actually pleasure is not the type of thing which can be measured. Now, there's a second strand of criticism here. Even if you accept that pleasure can be measured, the calculus doesn't really work. And that's because it can be manipulated. Here I've got an example of a rich man who sells weapons to a foreign army to fund this foreign conflict. The guns are actually being used to kill people in a foreign war. Now, the rich businessman happens to be an altruist. He happens to be very generous. And he actually gives away lots of his money to charity. A lot of his money to charity. And maybe to the council as well. And he is able to actually transform the livelihoods of hundreds of people in his local area. Maybe he's funding schools and food banks. He's getting homeless people off the streets, for example. What we could do there is we can actually justify that on the calculus. So using these factors, we can justify the rich man selling the weapons. But the problem is we can also do the opposite. And we can also say that selling the weapons is also wrong. And this is a problem because it means that the calculus won't actually show that one outcome is right or wrong. All it's doing is justifying our moral intuitions. So my intuition is that selling the weapons is wrong, despite the fact that he's giving the money to charity. And so I can plug it into the calculus and get the outcome that I want. I can justify what I want. So it isn't helpful in moral dilemmas as it should be. All it's doing is verifying what I already want to be the case. I can manipulate it to achieve whichever outcome in a moral dilemma that I want. Next is the issue of partiality. So in utilitarianism, specifically quantitative utilitarianism, all pleasure is equal and all people are equal. I mean, that's a real strong point of the theory. There's a real equality that's being achieved. The problem is that isn't realistic. And so if you put my family member on the trolley problem, I'm always going to save my family member that I love. If you put down one family member or 5 people, I'm always going to save the family member. 1 person and 10 people, I'm still going to save the family member. And you can get it to quite absurd numbers. So you could even justify killing 100 people. Well, maybe not justify, but the reality is that you always would save the person who you love, who you have a relationship with. Now, this isn't accounted for by Bentham in quantitative utilitarianism. And so although you could say, Bentham could say, although you would save that person, it isn't moral, it isn't the moral thing to do, that's true. The problem is there's no account for it. We do value people differently, that's just human nature. And the problem for utilitarianism is that it seems to miss this out. I value other people more. I value the people who I love more. Now that may not be moral, but that's just the way it is. And utilitarianism does not account for this. And so it's not going to knock down utilitarianism, but it does show that because I value other people differently, there's a lack of account for this, and the simple quantitative account of Bentham is incomplete. Next criticism is specifically of Mill and his proof of utilitarianism, and that's the fallacy of composition. So the argument, the proof, commits the fallacy of composition. What's the fallacy? If I have one small brick in my hands, the brick has the property of smallness. It's a small brick. Or maybe it's just average sized. And I could say, if I put this brick into a wall, I could say, because the brick is small, the wall must also be a small wall. So the wall that the brick makes up is small. But that's to commit the fallacy. Just because one part of the wall is small, it doesn't necessarily follow that the wall itself is small, because I could just use lots of small or average sized bricks. You see what I mean? So the fallacy of composition is a failure in reasoning. It's assuming that a part of the whole has a property, and therefore the whole must also have that property. Now, specifically applied to the argument, it does not follow that because each person wants their happiness, that each of us also want the general happiness. That doesn't follow necessarily. I value my happiness, you value yours, but as a society, it doesn't follow necessarily that we value the general happiness. We have the property of wanting our happiness, but it doesn't follow necessarily that the general public want the general happiness, have the property of wanting the general happiness. Next issue, also quite a fundamental, classic criticism of utilitarianism, and that's the criticism that it's consequentialist. So it only values the consequences of actions and not the intentions of actions as well. Now, before I get started with this criticism, understand that the utilitarian can just accept that this is the case. It's intuitively a criticism, and it might put you off the theory if you're not a utilitarian, but if you are one, they can just accept that this is the case. So we can, again, provide a thought experiment. An evil scientist wants to poison London with cancer, and so he infects the Thames and the water systems with cancer. What he ends up doing is saving the whole of London and giving them all immunity from cancer. So he actually creates the cure for cancer as opposed to poisoning everyone with cancer. Now, if you just look at the outcome of the action, the consequence of the action, curing all of London and creating the cure for cancer, that's a great action. But his intention was literally the opposite. His intention couldn't have been more malicious and immoral. And so utilitarianism doesn't get everything. It isn't able to account for everything in morality. It's only able to account for the consequences. And yet intuitively, intentions are important as well.